On July 12th, SpaceX will attempt to raise $75 billion in an IPO that values the company at $1.8 trillion. It is said to be the most expensive public offering in market history, trading at an unprecedented 94 times revenue per share. But behind that valuation lies a massive structural risk. SpaceX filings reveals that the company just bled $4 billion in a single quarter. For a traditional aerospace firm, a capital burn of this velocity would trigger an immediate market boycott. Yet Wall Street is eagerly matching the asking price because they are not pricing in a rocket company. They are pricing in the dream of pushing the frontier in space. By merging XAI into the Starlink and SpaceX ecosystem, Musk has fused orbital logistics, broadband, and AI compute into a single behemoth. And with the Blue Origin's catastrophic launchpad explosion effectively grounding Jeff Bezos' lunar ambitions for the foreseeable future, the competitive landscape has collapsed. But rewriting the global infrastructure grid is not a small dream, and executing it requires absorbing an unfathomable amount of structural risk. To understand how we got to a $1.8 trillion valuation, we have to look at the only part of SpaceX that actually makes sense on a traditional balance sheet: Starlink. Right now, Starlink is essentially a license to print money. It makes up roughly 61% of SpaceX's entire revenue. If you look at the top line numbers, it looks like the ultimate corporate success story. They have successfully wrapped the globe in a mesh network of satellite broadband, cornered the maritime and aviation internet markets, and forced traditional telecom giants into a state of permanent existential dread. By all standard rules of economics, a business model this dominant should be drowning in free cash flow. Shareholders should be looking forward to massive dividends and a smooth, predictable ride. But this is an Elon Musk company, so obviously that's not what's happening. Instead, the S-1 filing drops a complete bomb on that beautiful narrative. Despite Starlink pulling in billions of dollars, SpaceX somehow managed to bleed $4 billion in a single quarter. Let that sink in. They aren't just spending money, they are incinerating it at a velocity that would make a 2021 Web3 startup blush. If Boeing or Lockheed Martin reported a quarterly cash burn like that, their stock would completely crater. The CEO would be fired by sunrise, and Congress would call an immediate emergency hearing. Yet Wall Street is looking at this $30 billion sinkhole in the balance sheet, nodding approvingly and saying, yeah, looks good, take our $75 billion. Why? Because the money isn't vanishing into thin air. If you follow the capital expenditure trail, the revenue from Starlink terminals is not funding rocket fuel. It's being aggressively rerouted into massive, earth-bound silicon infrastructure. Musk didn't merge XAI into SpaceX because he wanted his rockets to have better communication. He did it because artificial intelligence has a massive, unquenchable thirst for energy, and Starlink's cash flow is the perfect meat shield to fund it. Now, to understand the sheer scale of the financial sinkhole SpaceX has dug, we have to look away from the launch pads and look at the dirt in Memphis, Tennessee and Grimes County, Texas. The biggest bottleneck in the artificial intelligence arms race is not algorithmic breakthroughs anymore, it's physical infrastructure. Every major tech company right now is trying to buy hundreds of thousands of GPUs. But even if you get your hands on them, finding the gigawatts of power to actually turn them on is becoming a bureaucratic nightmare of zoning laws and tapped out electricity grids. This is where Elon Musk looked at the landscape and seemingly decided that if you cannot beat the cloud giants at making the best chatbot, you pivot to being their landlord. When Musk merged XAI into SpaceX, he didn't just bring over a bunch of developers working on Grok, he brought over Colossus. For those who haven't been paying attention to AI infrastructure, Colossus is a sprawling AI supercomputing complex spanning across the Tennessee-Mississippi border. Originally built in a mind-bending 122 days in an abandoned Electrolux factory, it is currently scaling towards over 500,000 NVIDIA GPUs and pulling in nearly 2 gigawatts of power. Colossus is so massively overbuilt that XAI is not even using all of it. They have quietly transformed from an AI lab into a compute-as-a-service vendor. Look at their SEC filing. Anthropic, the creator of Claude, which Elon Musk couple months ago called evil, just signed a deal to rent compute from Colossus to the tune of $1.25 billion a month. Google, in a state of apparent infrastructure panic, just inked a deal for $920 million a month to use xAI's data centers. SpaceX is using Starlink's revenue to subsidize the construction of the biggest terrestrial server farms on Earth, and then renting that capacity back to the very competitors trying to beat them. But renting out Nvidia chips is not enough to justify a $1.8 trillion valuation. The filings reveal something much more aggressive and, frankly, completely unhinged from a risk perspective. It's called Terafab. Announced just a few months ago, Terafab is a joint venture between SpaceX, Tesla, and Intel to build a $190 billion semiconductor manufacturing complex in Texas. Musk wants to completely collapse the global chip industry supply chain under one roof. We are talking chip design, fabrication, memory production, and advanced packaging all happening in one vertically integrated factory. The goal is to produce AI and space-hardened chips entirely in-house, completely bypassing the geopolitical bottleneck of Taiwan and TSMC. Musk is essentially pitching a future where SpaceX controls the entire vertical stack of the AI economy. From mining the power, to printing the servers silicon at Terafab, to racking the servers at Colossus, to beaming the data globally via Starlink. But let's be perfectly clear, this is where the filings start reading less like a business plan and more like a high-stakes casino ledger. Building a leading-edge fabrication plant from scratch is arguably the hardest manufacturing challenge in human history. TSMC spent 3 decades perfecting it. Intel, their actual partner on this, has spent the last 5 years repeatedly stumbling over their own shoelaces trying to advance their nodes. Yet Musk is projecting that they will spin up a fully functioning 2nm fab and hit massive volume production before the decade is out. If you read the fine print in the IPO documents, it is full of blaring sirens. SpaceX admits they don't have long-term agreements locked in with most of their chip suppliers. They openly warn that Terafab might face massive delays and flat out fail to achieve its targets. This isn't a project that yields returns next quarter. It is a 15-year geopolitical gamble that Wall Street is blinding pricing into the stock today. Retail investors think that they are buying shares in a company that puts satellites in orbit. In reality, they are financing a multi-$100 billion bet that Elon Musk can manufacture the entire global semiconductor industry while simultaneously acting as the primary power grid for the world's artificial intelligence. If it works, it is the most lucrative monopoly ever conceived. If it fails, that $4 billion quarterly cash burn is going to look like a rounding error. Let's strip away the romance of space exploration, because when retail investors hit buy on June 12th, they will be sold a marketing brochure filled with 4K footage of Starship and promises of a Martian utopia. But the S-1 filing is completely devoid of sentimentality. The rocket business, the exact thing SpaceX is famous for, is functionally just a low-margin logistics division. Launching commercial satellites for third parties is the utility. It is the aerospace equivalent of driving a highly explosive FedEx truck. The front page story of the IPO is about humanity conquering the stars. But the actual math reveals that the rocket division exists almost entirely to serve a single internal customer: Starlink. Right now, Starlink operates a constellation of thousands of satellites, controlling the vast majority of active mass in low Earth orbit, or LEO. And this is exactly where the terrestrial AI power crisis and SpaceX's orbital logistics violently collide. We established that Earth is rapidly running out of grid capacity to support the next generation of AI compute. The physical constraints are becoming insurmountable. The architectural solution to this is bypassing the terrestrial grid entirely and putting the data centers in orbit. The physics of this entire operation is brutally efficient. The two biggest operating expenses for an AI hyperscalers are electricity to power the GPUs and water to cool them down. In low Earth orbit, you have access to continuous unshielded solar power, and the vacuum of space acts as an infinite thermal sink. You don't need to negotiate with local municipalities for power allocations, and you don't face data center moratoriums. But making an orbital server farm a reality requires two extremely scarce resources: a dirt cheap method of holding thousands of tons of heavy silicon into orbit, and an optical mesh network capable of beaming the processed data back to Earth with almost zero latency. SpaceX is the only entity in human history that owns both. Starship is the heavy lift engine designed specifically to carry this physical infrastructure, and Starlink's existing optical space lasers, currently transferring data at 200 gigabits per second, act as the fiber optic cables connecting these future orbital clusters directly to ground stations. The most glaring takeaway from the IPO filing is the sheer terrifying lack of competition. Jeff Bezos, earlier this year posted a picture of a tortoise on social media. It was a nod to Blue Origin's corporate motto, Gradatim Ferocitia, step by step, ferociously. The underlying philosophy is that slow and steady wins the race. But the data tells a much more brutal story. SpaceX is functionally a full decade ahead of Blue Origin, and the tortoise is not just losing, it is practically paralyzed. The competitive landscape collapsed entirely last month. The catastrophic launchpad explosion of Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket pushed Bezos' timeline back by years, triggering a massive logistical failure across his broader corporate empire. Amazon's Project Kuiper, the only theoretical competitor to Starlink, was legally bound by an FCC deadline to have roughly 1,600 satellites of its 30 to 100 satellite constellation in orbit by July 2026. Because Blue Origin and other contracted providers couldn't consistently get hardware off the ground, Amazon barely managed to deploy a couple hundred. Instead of launching rockets, Amazon spent the first half of the year filing 125-page desperation petitions with the FCC begging for a regulatory waiver just to avoid losing their spectrum rights. And the legacy aerospace giants aren't faring any better. Boeing, the titan that helped put Apollo on the moon, when they finally launched their Starliner capsule on what was supposed to be a routine 8-day mission to the International Space Station, the propulsion system suffered catastrophic helium leaks and thruster failures. The situation became so dire that NASA had to strand 2 astronauts in orbit for over 8 months, ultimately suffering the indignity of calling SpaceX to fly a Crew Dragon up just to bring them home. The commercial space race is effectively over. Nobody else possesses the launch cadence, the capital, or the hardware capacity to build infrastructure at this altitude. SpaceX isn't commanding a $1.8 trillion valuation because they are building a colony on Mars. They are charging a monopoly premium because they are building the physical cloud literally above the clouds. They are locking down low Earth orbit to ensure that when the terrestrial grid finally taps out, the only place left to train the next generation of AI is on Elon's space servers. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into the SpaceX IPO. Distilling the sheer scale of this orbital infrastructure plan into 10 minutes was a challenge. But the goal here is always to give you the signal and not the noise. If you want more videos breaking down the mechanics of corporate strategy and macroeconomic shifts, hit the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment down below. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys in the next one.